Welcome to China Power. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Chad Sbragia, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis and was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for China in the Office of the Secretary of Defense during President Trump's first administration. Chad was most recently in China in September 2025 for the Xiangshan Forum, which is a high-level defense and security forum organized by China that's supposed to be an equivalent of the Shangri-La Dialogue. So I've asked him today to join us to discuss his views on the current U.S. China military relationship, as well as sharing insights from the Xiangshan Forum. Chad, thank you for joining me today.
Bonnie, thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I'd like to start this podcast off by asking you, what have you found to be most interesting or most surprising in observing U.S.-China relations, particularly on the military-to-military side, in the recent couple of months?
That's a great question. I guess I can start with just the kind of expectations of what people thought that the first year of the Trump administration would bring for defense relationships. Right now, it seems like both sides have kind of agreed to maintain working level contacts and exchanges, kind of punctuated or supplemented by occasional high-level contacts. And that seems enough. But the truth is that the expectations for the relationship were that it would take a very negative turn. I think the Chinese side certainly anticipated a much more antagonistic approach from the U.S. Department of War. And the truth is that's not what the department unveiled. The Chinese side did not see that at first. But once they recognized it and acknowledged it, what it really means is that there's room for other options to come into play in the defense relationship. So I think that's kind of the most surprising is a lot of the expectations for what it could or should be were proven to be untrue, and that there's kind of a broader horizon for where the defense relationship may go.
And to jump in here, do you think that that was just a Chinese assumption, or were there also assumptions by leading analysts in the United States that U.S.-China military-to-military relationship could suffer this first year?
There's such a wide spectrum of China watchers and observers and strategists. It's easy to say that there was groups all over the map, as there always is. But I think in general, there was a view that the Trump administration would be much more antagonistic towards the Chinese, particularly through the Defense Department. But if you listen closely to Secretary Hegseth's first real comments that emerged at Shangri-La, while it was reported as being very kind of deterrence heavy and antagonistic, it was actually a message that was the deterrence and assurance message. The Chinese did not hear that at first, did not see it. That was repeated to them through other channels. But ultimately, when the Chinese did see that, I think it's opened up, again, like I said, some broader horizons about what might be possible in the future.
And why do you think we're at where we're at now? Why has the relationship, to some extent, on the military-to-military side been better than people expected?
Well, the first thing is that Secretary Hegseth, he signaled right away that he was open to having contacts and exchanges or phone calls in this case with the counterpart that the Chinese side had put up. That did not happen previously. And so once he demonstrated a willingness to do that, and ultimately that resulting in, I think, a sidebar at Shangri-La, it said that they're ready to have high-level discussions. And then subsequently downhill, as the political appointees came into the Defense Department, that they have at least the ability to sustain what occurred or reemerged in the late Biden administration. So that's kind of where we're at. If you drop a plumb line, is that their approach might be a little bit different, but the actual substance or activities in terms of the contacts and exchanges remains very, very similar, almost exactly the same as the previous administration where they left off.
So some experts are saying that when we look at the U.S.-China military-to-military relationship, in many ways, it's a reflection of the overall U.S.-China relationship. And with President Trump meeting President Xi in October, and with more visits and meetings scheduled for next year, do you think there's a chance that the relationship could further warm up and that you might see a lot more U.S.-China military-to-military exchanges?
Yes, I do. I think the broader horizons certainly leave options open for developing out the defense relationship in a more robust way. I do agree that the defense relationship oftentimes is pinned to the overall relationship, sometimes in a supportive and other times in a kind of negative way. But where it stands right now from the United States is the Secretary Hegseth, really starting at Shangri-La, has opened up with a new approach that reflects both a deterrence message and an assurance message. I would be cautious to characterize it as it necessarily is warming, because I think that there's aspects of the department's approach to China that will be harder and demonstrate U.S. resiliency and resolve more, but also at the same time demonstrating that the intent is to not generate crisis or conflict. And so that's really what defense relations should be doing, which is being able to provide platforms to communicate intent and demonstrate understanding for both sides. And so in that regard, there's a chance for it to be a little bit more helpful to the overall approach from the United States and then specifically from the Defense Department.
And Chad, you mentioned when you were looking at the current U.S. China mil engagements for this year that they were very similar to what you saw last year and in the Biden administration. Was there anything that was new or different?
Yeah, so you kind of have to roll back in time a little bit here to kind of understand the trajectory from kind of where they were at the end of the last Trump administration to where they're at now, to kind of give you a better understanding of what the prospects might be here over the next year or into maybe the midterm. And that's really that the end of the Trump administration, both sides had agreed to develop more robust defense relationship that was resilient, kind of more lasting, that it shed kind of unnecessary elements of the defense relationship, kind of corrected some legacy elements that they wanted to retain, but really kind of laid a foundation for a new defense relationship. This approach, as developed by both sides, was called the policy dialogue system, and it included a much more holistic and kind of comprehensive defense relationship composed of several mechanisms. Unfortunately, in the spring of 2021, all of that really kind of ceased. The overall U.S. China relationship took a pretty sharply negative turn. That included basically the cessation of defense relationships other than kind of on life support, really until it was partially restored in late 2023. When it was partially restored, some of those elements came back in, such as the what's now called the Crisis Communication and Prevention Working Group, and some derivative efforts there, the Deputy Assistant Secretary level Defense Policy Coordination talks, Military Maritime Consultative Agreement talks, and some others. And so it's basically been at that kind of working level since the end of the Biden administration, and the current administration has sustained that. What the change in approach has been from the secretary is to indicate, and we've seen this reflected by the Chinese side, is that there's at least potential for options for additional elements to be reinstated or renewed or reforged. And that's really where we're kind of at now, is the decision of the department and, of course, the Chinese side is the degree to which they want to exploit those opportunities or different options.
And what are some of these new options, and in what ways do you see these new options solving problems or issues that we already have? Or are they mainly communication for the sake of communication?
Currently, what you don't have is you don't have any kind of mid or upper tier defense dialogues, any of those kind of contacts and exchanges at all. And why that's important is because those are the places where decision makers reside. They can solve and exploit opportunities for achieving agreement between both sides, resolve standing issues, or at least come to a better understanding of current issues. And you can't really do that at the working level. That just kind of helps make sure that you're at least talking, but you need some of those mid-tier dialogues to be enacted. Inclusion of senior level communications is good. The secretary or potentially the chairman or even Indo-Pacom in the future, those are nice, but you kind of need those mid-tier dialogues to do more. And so the anticipation is if you start to see that emerge or reemerge, the other element of that is if you see the reintegration of Track 1.5 sponsored activities by both sides to complement the regular Track 1 activity, and it'll be interesting to see whether that comes to maturation.
Just to make sure, when you're saying mid-tier, you're talking about Assistant Secretary of Defense level dialogues.
Assistant Secretary of Defense and Undersecretary of Defense, or Undersecretary of War for Policy. Those would be the two main ones.
And in terms of senior level dialogues, we did see in late 2023, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown, engage in a video conference with his Chinese counterpart. But since then, in the Trump administration, we haven't seen the chairman, from what I've seen, have that type of communication with his Chinese counterpart, but we have seen the communication at the Secretary of War level, at Secretary Hegseth's level.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't believe that the chairman or Indo-Pacific Command have talked with any of their counterparts yet. Typically, in defense relationship, we kind of classify those as senior level contacts, meaning those communications between senior levels don't really characterize those as dialogues, meaning it's some kind of agenda and an extended meeting that really aims to generate some solutioning or some decisions at the appropriate levels. They're important, but they're a little bit more distinct. So the part that seems to be missing right now, well, I shouldn't say missing. What I should say is there's options to fill a gap that could do more in the relationship if both sides, in this case, the Department of War, find that would be helpful to the overall approach from the United States. So that's really their choice, is to see if that's helpful. The point is, it's wrong to say that something's missing. Saying something's missing is really subjective. If both sides are satisfied, nothing's missing. However, both sides have, in this case, signaled that additional mechanisms may not only be desired, but necessary, and currently no exchanges or mechanisms are in play for defense policymakers at or above the deputy assistant level, which is where kind of substantive agreements can be deliberated and pushed up to higher levels. And that's kind of where we stand now. The important part is that both sides have signaled that they might be interested in doing that.
And in terms of both sides' interest in more military-to-military contact, do you think the goals of each side are similar or different? So, for example, on the U.S. side, is our goal mainly for crisis management, deconfliction, or do you see those mil-mil contacts as also important in terms of shaping PLA behavior, maybe even intelligence gathering or preventing miscalculation?
That's a great question. And I've kind of learned to cope with the unique features of U.S. China defense relations. And in doing so, kind of recognize that the service to U.S. national interest, which includes everything that you listed and more, that kind of the most important technique right now is that you just kind of, and this may sound a little bit sophomoric, but it has repeatedly proved kind of essential by the occasions when each side ignores this technique, which is simply to create conditions where you can listen to and understand the other side's perspectives. And so right now, the decision that we know of is that the U.S. side has decided to sustain this working level, Deputy Assistant Secretary level set of contacts and exchanges, with both sides indicating that more might be options that both sides could agree to. And that's really the question. I suspect a lot of that, particularly from the U.S. side, will come out as you see more of the strategic documents like the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy emerge, that might generate putting some of those other options on the table, but that has yet to emerge yet. So what has emerged from the Chinese side is that they've announced a new kind of characterization of what they're seeking from the defense relationship, which is, as they now characterize it, a healthy, stable, and sustainable defense relationship. And in that kind of tells you that they might be open to greater aspirations. And the one thing I would add to that is in the readouts from the latest secretary meeting with Admiral Dong Jun, the Minister of Defense in China, in Malaysia, was an aspiration by the Chinese side or an advocacy or proponency for academic scholars and think tanks to help contribute to the Track 1 defense relationship, which is really unprecedented as far as I know, for them to publicly state that. That raises considerations and implications about how that might affect others more broadly in the U.S. China Watcher community.
So a lot to unpack here. In terms of talking with the Chinese, you said earlier one of the most important things is just to hear them out. I know there's, I would probably say, widespread skepticism in DC about whether you can trust what the Chinese say. What do you see as important in terms of hearing them out? Like, what are you trying to hear from them? How much value do you actually place in terms of trusting what they're saying or telling us?
I've come to appreciate defense relations based on really what it is and not what you project onto what it should be. It is what it is. In cybernetics, there's a famous heuristic that the purpose of a system is what it does. And likewise, for bilateral U.S. China defense relations, it's the same heuristic, right? So it is what it is. Most of the critiques I hear really from both sides, from those with kind of no experience in doing it in this unique relationship, which resides at the nexus of kind of force and statecraft, or from those who have some experience but have built up so much scar tissue from expecting unreasonable outcomes. The truth is that the fundamental basis of defense relations, at least for the United States and China, are to understand the capabilities and intent of the other and to avert unintended crisis or conflict, usually by communicating what your position and resolve and interest sets are. So listening and understanding, but also communicating effectively and clearly what is in the United States' interest is kind of the fundamental piece of it. That's why I think it's important to do that. And I've only come to realize a little bit more late in the game for me is just how really impactful that is if you can take the time and really find the kind of political and professional and strategic kind of courage or confidence to just sit down across the table from these guys who often are not fully transparent and kind of understand them and listen to them. Then you can take measures of how much trust you put into that, but can't measure it at all if you don't listen.
That's a good point. You can't measure it all if you don't listen. And going back to your point in terms of what the Chinese want, I think you characterize it as a healthy, stable, and sustainable relationship. And I know in late November this year, the United States and China are hosting the military maritime consultative talks. And one of the things that I think we're finding now is there are less incidences of close encounters or accident or potential for collision between U.S. forces and Chinese forces in the region. Do you think that was a change in policy on China's end, or why are we seeing less of this year?
Well, that's a good question if you bring some of the PLA on to interview them. As a policymaker, you ultimately have to attribute that to a deliberate policy from Beijing. And so it's either an act of omission or commission by the leadership, but in either case is the degree to which the Chinese conduct unsafe or unprofessional behavior that's really risky at a strategic level and certainly places at risk the platforms and the service members. I've always found that there tends to be an aspect where the incidents are higher when there's a sense of dissatisfaction. Some of this goes back to my experience. There's a very clear and direct correlation between when you see the Chinese doing something that you don't want them to be doing, some kind of unsafe behavior or counterproductive behavior. It's oftentimes a direct correlation to the degree to which you're actually sitting down and talking with each other. So it's not just that we should listen to them, but there's a significant importance, which I've discovered really over the last 4 or 5 years now, of how important it is that you're communicating directly with the PLA and the PLA affiliated strategists about what the U.S. position is, because when they constrain themselves or only listen to themselves without being challenged, there's a significant tendency within China's system to make gross conceptual miscalculations or malformed assumptions about what's actually happening. It's not just listening from our side, it's making sure that the Chinese are listening to our side as well.
Right. Given how opaque the Chinese political system is, it's ensuring that our messages are delivered to the highest levels possible so that they can get to the right decision makers.
Yes, that's extremely powerful. And I really realized that to a significant degree when I was at DASD, and it's only been reinforced since then.
One thing you mentioned, Chad, that surprised you from the recent readout, some of the engagement, was a Chinese desire for, as you mentioned, academic scholars and think tanks to have exchanges. How is the Pentagon or those within the military thinking about this proposal?
I don't know. In the past, the United States Department of Defense at the time funded several what we would consider Track 1.5 or 2 events to help supplement defense relations. The track record there is mixed. There's some great successes there, I think. Certainly has informed a lot of our understanding, but it probably wasn't as managed as well as it should be. Part of the agreement in 2019 and 2020 that was developed under the policy dialogue system included a mechanism that incorporated those more formally to complement Track 1. That mechanism was called the Dialogue Augmentation Mechanism, which was to account for the unique features of Chinese own strategic and military culture and decision-making processes where you necessarily can't resolve things only through Track 1, is sometimes you have to have venues by which you can kick issues to test and explore solutions to Track 1.5 events. And so there's some hint that the Chinese might be open to that kind of activity before. What the U.S. Department of Defense's interest in that is, I'm not aware of that yet. So we'll have to see if that seems like something that fits the strategic outlines of the new incoming NDS. So.
Last question here before we move to the next section, where I want to learn about your experience at the Xiangshan Forum in September. As you look at U.S. China military-to-military relations, as well as you look at how the Chinese military functions as a whole, to what extent do you see the recent pretty large-scale purges of the PLA impact U.S. China mil-mil relations?
To say that there's no impact would be wrong. I think that there's certainly kind of disruption in China's system that impacts that. But there's 2 million service members in the PLA, and so they have enough people to kind of show up. I don't think that's an issue. The broader issue, which I've observed, is really that the PLA reforms have kind of generated some lasting problems. When the PLA undertook reforms in 2014, 15, 16, is one of the things that occurred was that the Office of International Military Cooperation took over control of all kind of defense relationship, which means at the time the General Staff Department, it was now not running through the Joint Staff Department. But what also was missing is there was interlocutors that were missing. And so there's no longer a counterpart per se for let's say, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And they have not found a replacement for that. And that's made just kind of the functional aspects of having defense relationship harder. The other thing is it bifurcated the Office of International Military Cooperation and the Joint Staff Department. So the Joint Staff isn't hearing directly from the Office of International Military Cooperation necessarily. And so there's different viewpoints and analysis that might go into the CMC and the senior leadership. The one change that has occurred as a result of the purges is that the Minister of Defense, from the position where Wei Fenghe was at, where he was a minister, state counselor, and he was on the CMC, to where we're at now with Admiral Dong Jun, who's Minister of Defense, but he's no longer in the CMC and he's no longer a state counselor. The perception, I think, is that his position has been degraded. A lot of Western observers, even I think the previous administration, kind of viewed that as a demotion and responsibility. But what the PLA are communicating is that it's actually an elevation in some ways, particularly relevant to U.S. China defense relations, in that he is a direct report to the chairman of the CMC and the chairman of the CMC alone, meaning that there's no kind of bureaucratic interference between, in this case, Xi Jinping, Admiral Dong Jun, and for our side, Secretary Hegseth. So I think it's important to kind of take stock of what these changes in senior leadership practices have been in China and cope with how that affects us and our approach. In this case is maybe it's not a bad thing that we have somebody that talks directly to Xi Jinping alone and doesn't have to have it vetted or changed in between. And so the purges in this case may not all be negative.
Fascinating. I think in some ways that might explain why Secretary Hegseth is willing to engage with Admiral Dong Jun more so than we've seen prior secretaries of defense. Perhaps the understanding that Dong Jun might be reporting directly to Xi Jinping could be a factor there.
Yeah, the Chinese side is very adamant about that when you talk to them. It's a very sensitive topic, and both sides should agree that you don't get to pick your interlocutor necessarily. You might have a say in it, but it's up to the other side. And the importance is that who you're communicating with is effective for what the U.S. interests are, which is, in this case, the secretary communicating to the chairman of the CMC directly what the U.S. views are. And that seems to be working.
So given what you described in terms of U.S. China mill, largely similar to prior years, but showcasing more willingness on the part of our Secretary of War to engage with the Chinese side, and as well as more desire from the Chinese side to have a healthier, stable, more sustainable U.S. military-to-military relationship. Within this context, in September of this year, you were in Beijing to attend the Xiangshan Forum, which is China's equivalent of the Shangri-La Dialogue. And of course, you've attended this forum in prior years too. A lot of folks have noted that this year's Xiangshan Forum was very different and in many ways more important than usual. In particular, it built on the early September PLA parade in Beijing, where China showcased a range of new military systems, and it also showcased Xi Jinping flanked by Vladimir Putin as well as Kim Jong-un. What did you see at the forum that you found interesting? And when you were at the forum, was there anything that really surprised you?
Yeah, a couple of things that surprised me, and I'll start with the anniversary and the related military parade associated with that, which is what the Chinese believed the perceptions of that would be, and then what the perceptions actually were by most of the international community. So I think the Chinese wanted to certainly project strength and a deterrent capacity, but I think they also wanted to showcase their role. And as one of my colleagues notes, is that them connecting the outcomes of World War II and China's role in that, not necessarily the PLA's, but China's role in that, as to the efficacy of the current international system and the advocacy of China to promote its own global governance initiative and other international system initiatives. They were trying to link all those together. I think that certainly the perception by many was this was highly antagonistic, really unhelpful. It looked bullying. It certainly didn't look like it matched the status of somebody who aspires to be a great power. And then it was not only ahistorical, but just patently divergent from what the common understanding of most of World War II is. The other interesting thing I found from Xiangshan was just how clear it was that at the time, the Chinese side, the analysts and strategists simply were not hearing Secretary Hegseth's and the Department of War's message of this kind of balanced deterrence and assurance approach. It was very clear. In fact, it was utterly rejected at the conference that even existed. The opening comments by Zhang Youxia at the dinner, Admiral Dong Jun in his plenary address, was reflected in pretty substantive change by the closing remarks at Xiangshan, where they just directly attacked that proposal that the U.S. might have a more sophisticated approach. It's ironic that since Xiangshan and ultimately at the close of the bilateral contact in Kuala Lumpur between the secretary and Dong Jun, is the Chinese published openly a recognition that, yes, in fact, we now acknowledge that the U.S. has this two-pronged approach and that they're willing to kind of engage or have contacts and exchanges or a defense relationship based on that. So that's a significant change you saw that reflected both kind of malformed assumptions that can emerge in China if you don't talk, and that if you are persistent with your signaling and messaging, you can bring about a change of perception in China.
So from your perspective, there was a major change between mid to late September to October when Secretary Hegseth met with Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun. And you attribute that change, at least a part, to more messaging from the U.S. side to the Chinese. And then, as we were talking about earlier, probably a part to the overall context of the U.S. China relationship with the two presidents meeting. Was there anything else from your perspective that changed between September and October?
I think you spotlight one, which is the meeting between the two presidents was significant. That's always an important feature of the defense relationship, which if there's consensus by the two leaders, in the case of China, that Xi Jinping really kind of directs his PLA to get after it, they will. When it's neglected by either side's leadership, the defense relationship tends to kind of enter a period of lethargy, or it tends to kind of devolve a little bit. So the current messaging from the Chinese side is that they got the message loud and clear from Xi Jinping, not only to at least sit down and discuss with the U.S. side about what the defense relationship could be, but to be very clear in signaling that they're following that direction, right? And it certainly seems that that's what the secretary has proposed now repeatedly. I think the prospects will be whatever is in the interest of the both sides, but ultimately there's kind of more options on the table now than there were maybe 6 months ago.
Going back to your point about how the United States has a dual approach to China, in what ways do you see China as also having a dual approach? Because as you were mentioning earlier, right, we do have China potentially taking a warmer tone to the mill between September and October. But at the same time, publicly, you're still seeing China make comments about U.S. military activity. You're also still seeing China's rapid military modernization. You're still seeing significant Chinese military exercises. To what extent is the mill aspect just one aspect of what we're seeing, and we shouldn't take necessarily more military to military engagement as an indication of China's strategic intentions?
Normally, in practice, we don't call it engagement. Engagement's kind of a technique. We call it contacts and exchanges, but it's the challenge of defense relationship is very unique. This is a little bit sui generis because we just don't have a robust defense relationship with any other nation that we have overall antagonistic relationship with. So most of our defense relationships are with partners and friends and allies. And so to sustain something with the United States, or with China in this case, is you have to figure out a way to work with the Chinese side under a rubric where the overall relationship is at least competitive, if not characterized best as a rivalry. And particularly for the defense relationship, because as I think I mentioned earlier, is, the defense relationship kind of resides at the nexus of force and statecraft. And you're always having to balance those two. For the Chinese perspective, I think they've always had a two-pronged approach, which is try to have contacts and exchanges to influence, but then also sending strong deterrent messages as they build out their force towards the 2049 goals.
One final question on the Xiangshan Forum. We've seen a lot of analysts talk about the Xiangshan Forum in terms of what you were mentioning earlier, which countries were there and which countries weren't there. And what we saw was a U.S. representation that was lower than in prior years, but also a massive expansion of participants at the Xiangshan Forum, including a lot more participants from the Global South. Did you see the forum as a continuation of China's military parade from early September as a way for China to really showcase military power, but perhaps the parade showcasing China's hard power and the forum showcasing China's soft power?
Yeah, and I think I would add to that what you would refer to as kind of China's military discourse power, right, is being able to engage. The interesting thing is that it's been 9 months to a year since Xi Jinping, as chairman of the CMC, really highly constrained defense relations kind of writ large globally, and specifically with the United States, it's been very constrained. The indications from the Chinese side, starting at Xiangshan, is that that's on the cusp of changing, and I think that you've seen that as a result of the presidential meeting and the secretary's meeting, is that the prospects for 2026 is that there's certainly open to doing more. And then we'll just kind of see how that manifests in terms of the interests of both sides to do that. In terms of representation, that's a difficult decision because obviously the basic calculus is, do you add the legitimacy, which is significant from the United States by attending, or do you risk not participating and kind of giving blank space for the Chinese? And I don't think that there's necessarily a wrong or right answer there. I was the first deputy assistant secretary that attended Xiangshan. We may have been at a different place in the relationship at that time, certainly a little bit different approach to China at that time. But one of my instincts, I guess maybe as a former Marine, was just you get in the ring. And I don't think the United States is best postured when it's fearful of getting into a ring, even in front of a crowd that is, in many cases, extremely hostile to the United States. I think it's important to show up. I would certainly emphasize that the Chinese do give opportunities for voices from other places, to include the United States, to say what they want to say. And I think it makes the Chinese side have to confront things that they would otherwise maybe want to ignore. One of the other main outcomes, which I've certainly come to appreciate, is just how much our allies and partners who do attend are really looking for a strong, positive U.S. voice and message, not just of a deterrent message to China, but, an assurance message both to them and to China. They're looking for that.
Just to recap, the Xiangshan Forum was a fantastic opportunity for us to gauge how China was understanding U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. Through your attendance, you saw that there was lots of misunderstanding, but what we saw about a month later was almost a complete 180 shift in China's understanding of the United States, including publishing even an article describing the U.S. two-pronged approach toward China. So I want to follow up, Chad, with you on two things as we move forward from the U.S. side. One is that we're expecting the Pentagon to release the 2025 iteration of the China Military Power Report, which is a report mandated to Congress assessing China's military capabilities, for which you led the co-authoring for many years from OSD. If there's one top one that you can think of, what do you want the CMPR to cover?
Oh, I don't know if I can just choose one. I would certainly appreciate a deeper understanding of a couple topics that continue to evolve in China. China has developed a new joint operational concept, or what they call a joint operational outline, that's been maturing for several years. I'd love to see a deeper understanding of that. There's not a ton of that that's public. The Chinese are certainly working on that and putting that into practice. There's a Marxist-based and proprietary Chinese military theory that they're looking to produce. That's been under development now for a decade. They haven't quite got there, but I think that's important because it conceptualizes how they think about future conflict. And it's supposed to be China's contribution to global military thought. The last would be is how the PLA are conceptualizing fighting in a kind of systems-based conflict. That China's systems concept of Shitongganyan is not well understood in the United States. In terms of war fighting, I think it would be very important to understand how they're thinking about that. They write about that a lot. I'd love to see that in the CMPR be covered. And this is based on some interactions with the Chinese of some of their changes to some of their national level deliberative forum, like the National Security System and the Central Foreign Affairs Commission. It's just that there's an increasing PLA interaction in what we would deem kind of interagency deliberative bodies. And I would love to see is the expansion, what's the impact and role and implications of an increased PLA activity in collaboration with other organs of Chinese power through these systems. I think that's an important expansion of what the China Mill Power Report probably needs to reflect.
Thank you, Chad. And last question for you. We're all eagerly awaiting the new national defense strategy. What is your understanding of how it will prioritize competition with China or Taiwan as the pacing threat?
Yeah, so the Secretary's guidance for the development of the NDS, characterizes China as the pacing threat. I don't know what's in it. I think we're all eager. I know it's an extremely high priority for the Chinese to get a look at it. What I'll be looking for is the degree to which it recognizes or hopes both sides recognize the value of an approach that understands and prioritizes the distinction between the kind of increasingly dominant distal causations of conflict and the proximal causations of conflict in the U.S. China relationship. If both sides, or in the case of the NDS, it prioritizes the distal drivers, it may serve as a basis for a more comprehensive defense relationship. And if both sides retain kind of a minimalist approach, it's a signal that the proximal drivers kind of remain the priority here. And what I mean by that, proximal drivers being issues like Taiwan or other sovereignty issues, or if they prioritize the distal drivers of crisis or conflicts, such as the broader systemic rivalry that's underway between the United States and China. So it'll be interesting to see how it kind of characterizes that.
Thank you so much, Chad, for joining me today to discuss the U.S. China military-to-military relationship, which you've characterized as largely the same as prior years, but in some ways with more opportunity in terms of more military to military engagements, and hopefully at the mid-level in 2026, and for also describing your experience and perceptions at the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing in September 2025. Really appreciate you joining me today.
Bonnie, thank you. Thank you to CSIS for this.